Property ownership comes with a lot of questions, and when damage happens, those questions get a lot more serious. Restoration 101 is a resource for property owners, managers, and industry professionals who want straight answers about the restoration process, the insurance process, and how to make smart decisions when it counts. This is Restoration 101, brought to you by Restoration One of Austin.
All right, we're back for another one here, Restoration 101. My name is Robert Martinez. I'm Vice President of Development at Restoration One of Greater Austin, and this is
I'm Hector Gutierrez. I'm one of the project managers here at Restoration One of Austin.
to kind of give you an idea. I've been on board with this team for going on 8 years, and I believe Hector, same?
Just about 8 years.
8 years, right? We've pretty much have seen it all up to this point, it seems like.
I like to say we have, and then from time to time you get thrown a different project where keeps you on your toes.
Of course, we kind of operate under the always the same thing, never the same thing twice. And so there's always some kind of variable that gets tossed into the weeds that usually changes it from what it normally always is. So what we're going to do today is we're going to cover a few things. What homeowners don't understand about mitigation until it's too late, mitigation versus reconstruction, why drying time isn't negotiable, and the science of drying, what's actually happening behind the walls, and the biggest mistakes made after a water loss. First thing we're going to get into is what homeowners don't understand about mitigation until it's too late. We're going to break down the common misconceptions and why fast action matters. So in the event of a loss, you realize either something's ongoing or something doesn't look right. Let's go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah. So the first thing, obviously, that most homeowners will notice is either some staining on drywall or some puddles around flooring. It's depending on the type of source that we're working with. A lot of times it's important to get that cleaned up right away, but beyond that, there could be water underneath the floors, inside the walls, in insulation, a lot of different places where you don't necessarily think that it's traveling into. And that's essentially what causes secondary damage. And that's where a lot of homeowners more or less can get into trouble there.
Right. Water kind of likes to follow the path of least resistance and gravity takes it places. And so whenever there's a failure, can you kind of go over, like with engineered flooring or laminate flooring, how that might look and why homeowners can't necessarily see where the water is migrated to?
Definitely. So with laminate flooring, a lot of times it's floating laminate floors. It does have a moisture barrier, which creates more or less some separation between the slab and the floors.
Okay.
Which is a great pathway for that water to continue traveling to travel and travel and travel. You can kind of think of it as like a sponge underneath your floors, right? Every time there's pressure or, everyone step in, depending on foot traffic, that water can spread a little bit further out, further out, further out.
So now the typical homeowner, when they do see stuff like that, they'll just be like, okay, let's just grab a towel or a blanket and then let's dry up as much water as we can, and then we're done with that. Why is that an issue?
The issue is that they're not seeing all the water underneath it. And so while you may be able to get the water on the surface, the water has definitely traveled underneath or into walls. And again, that's later going to sit there for a long period of time. If it's not being addressed immediately, it can start causing growth. It can start causing further deterioration to materials. At the end of the day, we may be able to salvage certain materials like engineered hardwood floors. That is essentially really time sensitive. Time is of the essence. The quicker we're there to set up either wood flooring, dry mats, or a dehumidifier to help extract some of that water, the higher the chances of us saving those floors are. So a lot of times, if we're not getting to them, in a timely manner, they can start buckling or again, start traveling, create secondary damage.
Okay. Now, when it comes down to the hardwood floors kind of deal, or laminate flooring or engineered wood, a lot of flooring companies are marketing stuff as waterproof flooring. And so it seems like homeowners are under the false impression that it can withstand a failure of that kind of deal where water actually compromises the backside of the flooring. And so how does that look in your world?
That's a great question or interesting point. The floor itself may be water resistant or waterproof, but what about the materials behind it or around it? Right. A lot of times we're dealing with subfloors potentially where it's organic, material. that
Hmm.
isn't waterproof. A lot of times, again, that pretty much promotes or allows water to keep traveling underneath the floors, where now it's reaching sill plates, drywall, and those materials aren't waterproof. So even though a lot of these floor manufacturers are getting creative and developing ways of preventing damage to floors, it doesn't necessarily mean that, again, that every material inside the house is as resistant as those floors are.
Yeah. And so whenever you start getting into the whole timeline deal, well, I guess this is another point why time is so crucial to get it addressed as soon as possible. So in the event that there is a failure and people do have laminate floors or engineered floors, what are you looking at as far as a success rate to save those floors?
Time is of the essence. So I would say if we can get in there fairly quick and start our process, considering different circumstances, right, we fairly do have a good success rate. It's when we're getting called in on third day, right, or fourth day. Um, Once you give you an example for say, right? Let's go ahead and say it's a Monday. You go ahead and notice, that there's water damage on your floors.
Yeah.
Go ahead and wipe that down. You don't think that it's anything big, right? Let's say 2 days later, you start noticing some of the seams start to buckle. At that point, you're going to call a restoration company out there. You're still interested in saving or salvaging those floors. At that point, even if we can dry certain materials, a lot of times the swelling's already there.
Mm.
Swelling's not going to go down. At that point, the chances of us actually saving those materials or having them go back to pre-loss can then diminish right at that point because the damage is already incurred.
Okay. Now, typically, what you see, the way, especially in kitchens, kitchens are built out of one or two ways. Whenever they've got flooring, and so they've got either laminate flooring or engineered flooring that typically goes up to a, series of counters and cabinets. And so, we'll go ahead and run us through the process of what happens if the cabinets are built on top of the flooring, or if the builder decided to go ahead and put flooring all over everything and then set the cabinets on top of that.
Yeah, so you can most of the time you're going to come across those two different scenarios, right? Whether the flooring stops right up against the cabinets, specifically with floating floors or
Mhm.
any water traveling underneath the floors. We refer to it as a toe kick, right? As you're walking into cabinets, more or less, where your toes would kick,
Mhm.
or make contact with the base of the cabinet. Keep in mind that's hollow, right? So a lot of times you just have a board there, essentially creating a barrier. If water goes underneath it, the base of the cabinets or may also be affected as well.
Yeah.
Um,
So what are we looking at from a mitigation restoration aspect of it in that scenario?
in that scenario, we'll pop open the toe kicks, we'll assess the damage to the cabinets, and then we'll see. A lot of times those can be dried in place.
Mm.
The issue is where flooring or the cabinets are installed on top of the floors. At that point, if we do end up having to remove floors, you're looking at detaching most of the time lower cabinets or any full size cabinets, full height cabinets, I should say. And that's where the damage gets a little bit more invasive as far as demolition and things of that nature. Oftentimes we can try to explore options as far as detaching those boxes intact. But if it's like any MDF, things of like that nature that are, pretty fragile, a lot of times these materials aren't necessarily made to be, moved
Mhm.
or detached. A lot of times they're made to stay there and permanently
So you
installed.
said cabinets made of MDF. What for the people that aren't really familiar with what MDF is? What's that?
It's a MDF is essentially a hybrid. It's a lot of wood components that are pressed together. Um, and so MDF does get damaged by water a little bit easier. So anytime that MDF gets wet, a lot of times it does tend to swell immediately.
Okay.
Um,
And you can't save that.
No, you can't save it. A lot of times you're gonna go ahead and remove it. A lot of times it starts to break apart. It gets real brittle. That or you'll see more or less the clear water stain,
Mhm.
where more or less it's been affected.
Now on true hardwood cabinets, is there a success rate in saving those if it's true hardwood?
I hate to say it depends,
Mhm.
but it's all dependent on the on the
On timeliness?
on timeliness and the different factors, right? If this is the first time they've ever been affected and we get there fairly quick, we can most of the time save them. If this is a leak that has been going on for a long period of time or just presented itself over a long period of time, then obviously at that point we have to explore all different factors and things that contribute to the actual damage itself. Whether, it's on an exterior wall too, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times exterior walls are insulated.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the insulation is affected, right, oftentimes you can notice that, let's say it's an exterior wall, you can see water coming out of the weep holes on the exterior side of the home, along brick, siding, things of that nature. So at that point, good chances are that we're going to have to get into the exterior wall, pull some of that wet insulation out, so that way we can essentially address the framing and prevent that secondary damage to the framing.
All right, let's talk about it. If the flooring, and right now we're just assuming that everything is one story, and this is the only thing that we're looking at is one story home. If the difference between tile and flooring that's manufactured or engineered. So does tile need to come up in water damage situations?
Tile can come up. Usually tile on slab, we can dry in place.
Mhm.
Our success rate with that is fairly good. A lot of times, if the grout is affected, or if we didn't necessarily get a good bond from the beginning, and it's now coming up, or it sounds really hollow, those are the times where we'll explore removing tile. Um, a lot of times too, if tile is on a subfloor, a lot of times you have to think of, again, as far as how the building science goes, there's materials underneath that tile that aren't, water resistant or aren't waterproof, right? So if, let's say, let's talk about it, like let's say in a bathroom floor that has tile on upstairs, we can attempt to dry it in place by removing, drywall downstairs, ducting a dehumidifier into that cavity, send a dehumidifier upstairs. We'll monitor it for about 3 to 5 days, see what type of progress it makes. And if it's not making sufficient progress within that time, then at that point, then we come across potentially going into secondary damage. So at that point, the focus kind of shifts from making sure that we're drying in place into preventing secondary damage to your home. So at that point, we want to make sure that subfloor is not going to be affected. It's not going to be any growth underneath that tile or the hardy board. So at that point, again, we do go ahead and remove it. But obviously, if tile can be saved, we most definitely will try to salvage the material. The whole point of the restoration, honestly, is to save what we can. Sometimes we can. Sometimes, depending on certain circumstances, we'd have to be a little bit more invasive with the demo.
Okay, so we've covered a little bit on flooring and some cabinets, and let's say we've had a failure, and flooring isn't necessarily compromised, but a wall is. What are we looking at? What's going on the backside of a wall or the inside of a wall?
Good question. Is it an interior wall? Is it an exterior wall?
It's both, interior and or exterior. Let's go ahead and cover both bases. One, let's go ahead and give the definition of what an interior wall is.
Interior wall typically is a wall that separates, let's say, a living room from a bedroom, right? Or any walls that aren't necessarily insulated.
Okay.
The building construction, or as far as the building sciences go behind that area, right? You're looking at potentially some baseboard, some drywall, and then you have your sill plate at the bottom, and then you have all your studs pretty much running vertically. On the other side, it's the opposite, right? You're going to have drywall and then a baseboard. On, let's say, the bedroom side of things. Those walls, oftentimes we can dry in place. We have specialty drying equipment like injector dries that we can essentially redirect or focus that air inside the wall cavity and attempt to dry in place.
That's when you drill holes in the wall and put the injector
and
dry?
The injector dry, essentially, yeah. So it's pumping in warm air into the wall cavity, into the wall structure. What we do here in particularly is we essentially have pins that could go in a little bit deeper than the pins on your meter.
Mhm.
So we usually go ahead and insert those into a wall stud or a sill plate, and we monitor progression as far as the moisture goes, right?
So you're not in there to demo everything. They're actually dry in place.
No, exactly. At that time, we can dry it in place. We actually just had a pretty recent project where there was multiple stories affected in a building. And we used about 10 injector dries throughout the whole project, and we actually were able to save a lot of these walls. Now, exterior walls are a little bit different.
Okay, definition of an exterior wall?
Exterior wall is typically a wall that's going to have a perimeter around your home, or maybe splitting up, let's say, an inside room from your garage, right?
Yeah.
Living spaces versus a non-living space. And those are typically going to be insulated 9 out of 10 times. Different insulation forms, right? You can have blown-in insulation, you can have bad insulation, you can have foam insulation. And so at that point, depending on what type of insulation is present or how much moisture there is, again, 9 out of 10 times, we're probably going to have to remove some drywall, remove that wet insulation, so that way we can ensure that the framing is drying appropriately.
Yeah, that sounds it definitely could be a whole lot more labor intensive, especially if there's spray foam insulation in there.
Spray foam cabinets, bathtubs up against them.
Oh, that's right.
Um,
That's right. Because a lot of times in master bathrooms, you will have either a stand up shower that's facing an exterior
and
wall.
next year, well, yeah, if you
Yeah.
think about most bathrooms will have that. Kitchens too. A lot of times you'll have, cabinets and kitchens pretty much facing the exterior wall. A lot of
Mm,
the
yeah.
plumbing and the faucets are more or less right around that area. So,
Yeah. I mean,
um,
typically they say the two most expensive rooms in a house are the kitchen and the master bathroom.
yes, sir.
And so if you start breaking it down in terms like that, especially if there's a failure on an exterior wall, you could have problemos.
Problems for sure.
Yeah. All right. Now that kind of is on the mitigation stuff on flooring, on a little bit of walls. And so with restoration is broken up into two parts. There's the mitigation portion, which is the removal of affected materials, setting in equipment to dry, letting it dry with equipment runtime until that's completed, and that's the mitigation phase. A lot of people get confused and think that mitigation is also reconstruction. So let's go ahead and talk about the differences of mitigation versus reconstruction and where the line actually is whenever it gets transitioned into reconstruction.
Yeah. So whenever I'm on the field and I'm explaining things to homeowners, or as far as what our process entails, is I always like to break the whole restoration process into two phases. First phase consists of the mitigation, which is removing the affected materials and drying the structure in place. We'll keep it pretty general, right?
Sure.
A lot of that can be, we
Right.
could take a deep dive into things and timelines, et cetera,
Yeah, we
right?
can
But
nerd out on it.
essentially, to keep things simple is again, you're looking at those two phases, tearing out the material and getting everything dried out as far as the mitigation is concerned. On the reconstruction side is getting everything pretty much back to pre-loss conditions. At that point, back it until flooring replacement, drywall, re-insulating walls, painting, replacing siding, brick, you name it. And so, where the line or where the process pretty much shifts over is at the end of the mitigation. We do generate what's called a certificate of completion that states that everything has pretty much been dried up to industry standards. And at that point, the project will transition from the mitigation phase over to the reconstruction.
I guess on a lot of the hangups and stuff, whenever something like this happens, it is a traumatic experience for a homeowner. You've got a situation where a leak has to be identified and addressed. So typically, they're out of pocket on that expense, and then they've got a restoration company going in there to go ahead and get them on the track back to get everything back to pre-loss conditions, and then all of a sudden their house gets torn apart. So I can only imagine that there is a lot of impatience or gray area on how long the dry out portion is going to take. What are you typically looking at for a dry out?
For dry out, it's about average about 3 to 5 days, depending on certain conditions,
Is
right?
that a regulatory standard thing or?
It's about average industry standard. Now, again, we've had projects that dry out fairly quick, 1 or 2 days. We've had projects that extend as far as 10 days. It all depends on the conditions, right?
Yeah, what are we looking at on the ones that go into the 7 or 10 day? What typically what indicators or factors come into play on that one?
Pressure treated materials, the space of the drying chamber. A lot of times, what we can do is, let's say we're not seeing the appropriate drying conditions or it's taking a little bit longer, we can get creative with containment chambers and trying to minimize the controlled area. So that way we can make our dehumidifiers a little bit more efficient. Same thing with floors, right? Floors sometimes can start off very slow, and then as the drying process continues, they can go ahead and more or less, I wouldn't say speed up, but make more progress towards the end of the process. So as far as the process, again, it takes about 3 to 5 days. The biggest thing there is really explaining that to homeowners as well, as far as the education portion is concerned. It's not just a matter of tearing the wet material out and then, go ahead and installing the new material. We know we've talked about a good amount about floors. Floors is a perfect example where some of this impatience may actually work against you. Let's say we don't dry off the concrete slab, or we don't let materials acclimate properly, and we just go ahead and just speed through the process. We've actually had some instances where we have to really educate the clients on the importance of the process and the timelines that are associated with these types of projects. Because if, let's say, we just go ahead and rush through them, we've had a project that we're actually called into where there wasn't any leak, but there was buckling on the floors, and so What we ended up finding out was that the floors were still wet. They were removed. Brand new floors were installed the next day, and therefore some of the moisture was transitioning from the slab into the new material and causing the floors to buckle and warp.
Yeah, compromising the new flooring.
Brand new floors. So
Right.
where, it may save you some time
Mm-hmm.
in the long run, you're now having to do this work twice.
Right.
And you're probably doing it for double the expense because
Right.
now all that flooring that you just purchased and installed, isn't reusable at times. A lot of times you're having to tear it all up,
Right.
put down some new floors.
Yeah, because that goes into why drying time isn't negotiable, and all right, the difference between science versus pressure from the carrier, from the homeowner to go ahead and start the reconstruction process sooner rather than later.
Correct. Yeah. So
And then at that point, I can only imagine, especially if it's a claim, if there was something on the reconstruction phase that started while there was still compromised material and it wasn't completely dry, I have a hard time thinking that the insurance company is gonna accept another claim if it wasn't mitigated
if it
properly.
wasn't mitigated properly, yeah, it can be it could be complicated. At that point, again, just educating clients,
Mhm.
educating or bringing in any material interested parties, such as adjusters, into the whole process is very crucial. Let him know and saying hey, this is what we're seeing as far as our dry logs are concerned. We're expecting prolonging drying times is very important. So at the end of the day, again, just keeping everyone in the loop, communicating updates, different strategies on what we can do is very important.
Yeah. And again, everything goes back into an operational process to be able to ensure that the structure has been dried properly so it can get put back together again. And so, all right, on a couple things here, what are some of the biggest mistakes that are made after a water loss that you've seen?
I've seen leaks just not be addressed in a
Mhm.
timely manner. I would say that's probably one of the biggest. Just not knowing whether there's again insulation behind it. More importantly, too, with like let's say wax rings, that's another big thing that we see.
Wax rings?
Wax rings.
What's a wax ring?
A wax ring is a seal between toilet
Mhm.
and the toilet flange,
Okay.
where a lot of the wastewater will essentially
The
travel through.
donut.
You definitely want to stay on top of that as
Mhm.
far as maintenance is concerned, right? You want to try to maybe replace those fairly, often, depending on usage. If it's a fairly used bathroom, then again, maybe every 2 years, depending on the certain circumstances. But more importantly, if let's say you notice any type of play in your toilet
Mhm.
when you're sitting, it shifts, there could be some leaks there not addressed. What we see in the industry most often is there's a little bit of water seepage that will essentially keep seeping out every time that, the bathroom is used, every time it's flushed over a long period of time. And you're not going to see it right away because it's not a pressurized leak where, you're spewing out water from a
Right.
supply line. It's not a slab leak where water's coming up and puddling on your floors.
And it's hidden.
It's hidden, right? So the subfloor is going to start absorbing some of that water every time you're flushing, every time you're flushing. Eventually, there is going to be a time where that material is so saturated it can't hold any more water.
Mhm.
It's going to bleed through. It's going to start feeling soft.
And hopefully you're not on the can when it goes.
Hopefully not. That'd be the worst. If you are, I don't know. You might be, might need to go to the bathroom faster at that point. But, at the end of the day, that is a type of damage that we do come across somewhat often.
Mhm.
We get called in, and then at that point, once we start removing some of the flooring, right, due to category 3 materials being affected, we see that the floors are, super rotted out or not there anymore. And that's where I would say a small, simple fix. Now you're looking at replacing parts of your subfloor.
Now you said category 3. So for clarification, what's category 3?
It's grossly contaminated with water. So a lot of times it's water that has bacteria, right? Fecal matter,
Okay.
bodily fluids, things like that.
And so
It's
on the
not clean water
mitigation,
going down your toilet.
on the mitigation process, if it's if that has been compromised on the wax ring and then it compromises your subflooring, all of that needs to come out on category 3.
Structural materials can be treated if caught in a timely manner. Again, we have antimicrobial sprays that we can use to treat material when it does become compromised to where it's not structurally sound. Right, we don't want to install a brand new toilet on a compromised subfloor at that time, at that point, you're essentially going to be dealing with some of the same issues. Same thing with it's a safety concern, right? You don't want to slap a new toilet on a subfloor that's about to fall through. Last thing you want to do is, like you said, fall through the.
Right. When you're on the can, the next thing you know, it's you fall down to the first floor from the second.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh man. What other mistakes have you seen that people tend to make?
Um, I see. I see a lot of it feels dry to the touch.
Or it looks dry.
Or it looks dry. And that could also, I'm a homeowner myself, but it can get us in trouble at times. At that point, just because something feels dry or doesn't look affected doesn't mean that there isn't anything going on behind that wall or behind that structure. We have specialized meters, special tools, thermal cameras, right, that can allow us to see behind the surface and see if there's anything that's going to, turn into a larger project or secondary damage later down the road.
Yeah. And again, the longer you let it go, the bigger the problem tends to get.
Correct. And I'm not sure about, other vendors. We offer complimentary inspections.
Right.
Totally free. Why not check it out?
Right.
Let's get ahead of it. Be proactive. Even if it's something small, call us in. We'll take a look. And then if it's nothing there, there's nothing there. If there's damage, then we'll let you know, and we can approach it at that point.
Okay. Let's see. What else we want to talk about here? Yes. Using fans incorrectly, because there are people, especially nowadays at Home Depot, a lot of Home Depots where they'll have equipment rental, where you can rent air movers and things of that nature. Tell us about what some of the mistakes people make when they try to do it themselves.
Yeah, so some of the mistakes is potentially not using it correctly. Like you said, there's big box stores that will rent equipment out to
Some do.
to DIYers, right? And at the end of the day, it's just making sure that how we're setting the equipment, what type of equipment that we're setting is right for the job. There's equipment that dehumidifiers, there's different sizes, right, that are appropriate for different size chambers.
So there's a mathematical formula.
Yes. There's an equipment calculator. There's also ways that you want to set the air movers to be the most efficient. What you typically want to do is create a cyclone with those air movers. You want to essentially create a vortex in that room, so that way it keeps pushing that air. And again, just optimizes the efficiency of that equipment itself.
Is it possible to put too many dehumidifiers in a room and do damage to a room?
Of course. More importantly, like if there's any special instruments that can cause damage to instruments. So you want to be mindful about the type of equipment that you're using and whether it's right for your project. As well as, like, again, like if you're going to set, air movement on an insulated wall, it may not be the right piece of equipment. You may want to, at that point, explore, at the very minimum, an injector dryer, see if it's maybe going to dry in place, or at that point, removing the drywall just to go ahead and remove that insulation.
Okay. One of the things that you touched on earlier is spraying down an antimicrobial. Is that stuff that you buy like at Walmart or what?
There's different types of antimicrobials. Again, you just want to make sure that the product that you're buying is going to treat your specific needs. Different needs, right, around pets. There's plant-based antimicrobials, chemical-based antimicrobials. So at the end of the day, if you have any pets, if you have, small children, things of that nature, just want to make sure that those aren't going to be hazardous to them.
Okay. Let's go ahead and then touch on, in the event.
Yeah, we've seen a little bit of a spike in fires. What in particular do you want to talk about first?
HVAC contamination. And so, again, whenever there's some type of either stove event in a home, which typically tends to happen.
Yeah. So with fires, as far as the severity of it goes, there's fires that are just very small as far as, hey, I was cooking and maybe there's a grease fire. It caught a little bit of the cabinets, maybe some soot and char on the cabinets. And there's fires that are pretty catastrophic as far as, affecting all the structure, making it, sometimes inhabitable. More importantly, with HVACs, the main thing is trying to identify whether the inside of the HVAC has been affected. Okay. So over the years, there's been hygienists that essentially have been able to, similar to mold, they've been able to test for soot and char and then be able to identify whether certain components are affected. We've recently had a project where, like you mentioned, there was a stove. There's a couple boxes on a stove that ignited. Fire was put out fairly quickly. There is some soot on walls that we essentially will need to clean. Most importantly, they were able to, again, test the HVAC. That's something that we didn't know was affected. It turns out the HVAC system was on during the time of the fire. And now there's soot and residual buildup inside the actual unit and throughout the ducts.
Really?
So a lot of times we focus on the specific structure against cabinets, drywall, floors, ceilings, but we're not looking at what I like to say, the organs of the home, right? The guts of your house there where you can clean all all the stuff that's on the surface, right? But if you're not taking care of a lot of these components that are expensive and are very critical to your home, you're only doing half of the project, or you're only doing half of the
Yeah, and your
the
AC is
recommend.
going to be running more often than not, especially here in Texas. It
Mhm.
runs 11 out of 12 months.
Yes, certain, not getting into too much of the science, there's certain materials that produce toxins at the time of combustion. And so a lot of times, like if they're in the HVAC system and they're, over long-term exposure can cause some type of health concerns to you as well.
So, what kind of process do you implement, I guess, in order to get? Because I know if anything plastic is burning, trying to get that smell out of your house has got to be damn near impossible, it would seem. So, what does that process look like?
The process from my point of view, a lot of times is taking care of the affected materials directly. You don't want to just go in there and start deodorizing the home. You want to treat what's causing the odor, whether that be charred materials, whether that be the soot on the wall, whatever the case may be. You want to address the actual cause of that smell first by removing or cleaning. Afterwards, you can start treating the actual air with ozones, hydroxyl machines. I would say it would be secondary as far as what the process is concerned.
And what time frame are you looking at for something like that to take shape?
Uh, Again, depends on the
Depends.
size of the fire, right? If it's something very small, we can take care of it, fairly quick. A lot of times too is identifying. Well, I would say some fires you want to get right in there and you want to start helping the homeowner because the longer the soot and the ash sit, the more it oxidizes. And so
Okay.
at that point, it's harder to clean. It's hard to get rid of the smell, right? A lot of times you do have to wait for the fire department to complete their investigation if they,
Determine if it was
suspect any type of arson or criminal activity. You want to address contents too, right? A lot of times we need to get in there and, clean walls, things of that nature. But in order to do so, in order to have proper access, we got to go ahead and treat the contents too, and then after that, obviously the structure. So there's a bit of a process to it. It can all vary depending on how much contents are affected, how long it takes us to go ahead and pack those up, inventory, move them out, store them, and then get more or less what I like to say boots on the ground for the actual cleaning and decontamination.
Yeah, so it can definitely be a lengthy process, especially if the fire department has to do an investigation to determine if it's negligence or arson or things of that.
Exactly. A lot of times too, you're doing industrial walkthroughs just to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as scope is concerned.
Right, right. So a lot of times on stuff like that, because it would be potentially insurance claim related, you have to deal with the insurance company and what their process is before they make that determination. So counter to what you're talking about it being done in a timely manner, you could also be at the mercy of the regulatory stuff that has to play out before the actual process needs to start,
Correct.
which then could lengthen the time for mitigation to take place and restoration, which then if more materials have been pulled into your HVAC system and they're sitting there for that longer period of time while the insurance company is trying to make that determination, it's only exacerbating your
Timeline and
back.
obviously whether we're able to salvage or have to remove certain materials or components of the home.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And then if it's inside of your HVAC system and then it's made, so it sounds like fire is a whole lot like mold. There's a protocol that gets put in place on how they want it done.
Yes, with the standardization of fire, a lot of times now to our benefit and the benefit of everyone really is the ability to be able to bring in hygienists to
Hmm.
essentially one test and add more science to the process. A lot of times in the past, it was really just based off of experience and again, just depending on the circumstances found the project, but now you can actually tie in testing into the actual process, which, in my opinion, goes a long way.
Yeah.
It's checks and balances, right? Once we do the work, they can come back in there, test, make sure all the work is done, into according to standards.
Sure, sure. Okay. Okay. Well, that was definitely informative on the fire stuff. Again, the way the regulations and stuff are starting to take hold as of last year, a lot of the fire stuff is starting to mirror mold, and so we're going to be covering that as the year progresses and we do this. Do you have any thoughts you want to chime in as we wrap this up? Anything in particular? Information, recommendations?
No, thank you for having me again. And just more or less want to just emphasize kind of what our topics are here. If you do find yourself experiencing any type of damage, don't hesitate, don't wait, call someone. The worst thing you can do is just let it go by.
Set it and forget it.
Yes.
That's the worst thing you can do. And it all starts with the first rule in all of this: identify and address a source before restoration can take place.
Correct.
Identify and address a source first.
Yes. Once you identify and address the source, again, don't wait, don't hesitate, bring us in, bring in a professional, identify what's affected, and we can then go from there.
Yeah. Next time we sit down with you and talk about, just to give you all a prep, what to look for, green flags and red flags on how to choose a restoration company. So, having said that, I thank everybody for the time, and we'll see you on the next one. Late.
That's a wrap on this episode of Restoration 101. Whether you're dealing with damage right now or just getting ahead of it, we hope you're leaving with something useful. Subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if we earned it, leave us a review. It helps more people find the show. We'll see you next time. This is Restoration 101, brought to you by Restoration One of Austin.